It's Monday, it's 12:15 and we're live in Westminster. Joining me, Conservative MP Andrew Bridgen, Labour MP Margaret Hodge, former Conservative Special Advisor Anita Boateng and money-saving expert Martin Lewis. Today, get ready for a delay in the final lifting of COVID restrictions in England.
The net result of his pathetic approach is that we're going to have 4 weeks more of this.
You've got hospitalisations up, you've got cases up. There are grounds for caution.
Should former ministers and prime ministers be banned from lobbying for 5 years? This website is a fake. Would you be taken in? And what did Emmanuel Macron say to Boris Johnson about Northern Ireland?
Ne perdons pas de temps dans des polémiques.
Let's not waste time in disagreements which are created in corridors or back rooms.
Yeah, I think it is offensive.
Let's start with that all-important decision on lifting restrictions in England. On June the 21st, it seems inevitable that reopening will be delayed. And to underline that big decision, there is a Prime Ministerial press conference later this afternoon and a statement in the House of Commons being given by Matt Hancock at 9 o'clock. Let's have a look at the headlines in a couple of the newspapers. The Daily Telegraph, one last heave to freedom, Prime Minister to urge, and this is how The Mirror has it on their front page. Wait for it, the 4 being 4 weeks in terms of a delay. Freedom Day on hold. So my question to the panel to start off the programme, the Prime Minister asking people to be patient one more time. How do you feel about that? Andrew?
Well, I think some people will be thinking, if not now, lifting the restrictions, when will it happen? I agree that infection rates have increased as we've lifted lockdown measures, but I'm not seeing that that's transposing into hugely increased hospitalisations. And I do worry that the public appetite for further lockdown, the public have been very patient and played the game, but I think their appetite for further lockdown measures could wane very rapidly.
Margaret, how do you feel about being asked to be patient one more time?
Reluctantly, I think in this particular instance, I will be supporting the Prime Minister if he takes this forward, to buy us time so that we understand better this new variant. We don't know yet, Andrew, whether it's going to translate into hospitalisations or deaths. We've got to understand that better. And we have the opportunity to inoculate another 9 million people. But I think I share the frustration that I saw in your clip from Keir Starmer, because we're in this pickle because the Prime Minister, yet again, failed to lock us down in time when it was clear that the variant, the Delta variant from India, was beginning to impact on the UK population.
Anita, your reaction to the news?
Well, I think it is disappointing. Of course it is. But the reality is that it seems that when you've got your second dose, you are much more likely to be able to resist the most aggressive impact of the Delta variant. So it seems to me to be sensible to give it that little more time to get a few more people vaccinated.
Martin, what about you?
Well, I've been very critical of the government's appalling message management throughout the last year and a half, but on this one, they set out a roadmap and they called these earliest possible days. And that was really a powerful message that was repeated again and again. So I think it's quite difficult to criticise for not going at the earliest possible day, for going a few weeks later if they believe the data holds that. But what we need to see, on a financial basis, certainly, is that support levels and furlough, if this is being extended, is extended commensurately. Business is going to have to pay more for staff on furlough. And of course, there are still the millions of people who have been excluded from financial support throughout the pandemic. And another month for them, when their finances are already catastrophic, is horrendous. So, yes, make the decision, but you can't ignore the underlying support mechanisms that is needed to keep some people going while we delay another month.
Right, well, Martin, we'll come back to that, actually, in just a moment, that issue of furlough. Let's have a look at the numbers that do seem to be informing the decision that we are expecting later on today. New COVID cases in the last 7 days, up to the 13th of June, just over 50,000. Now, you'll see that that is a big jump and increase of nearly 50%. When it comes to hospitalisations that Andrew and Margaret were talking about, and the number of patients being admitted to hospital with COVID, on the 3rd of June, 936. That's jumped to nearly 1,100 by the 10th of June. That's an increase of about 16%. And then finally, the all-important vaccination numbers. And here, total people vaccinated, percentage of the adult population, nearly 79% with the first dose, fully vaccinated with 2 doses, just over 56.5%. And it's this issue, the link, and whether vaccination has actually broken the link between cases, hospitalisations and deaths. This is how the Health Minister, Edward Aga, put it this morning.
If we're going at a run rate of about 250,000 to 300,000 second jabs being done each day, a month gives you roughly that 10 million.
And that's the calculation that the government says it is making, hence obviously preparing us for a delay of up to 4 weeks. On that basis, Andrew, would you vote for it whenever that vote happens?
I want to see the data. I would say that numbers of people hospitalised, the average age of those people now are in their 40s. They're much more resistant to the worst ravages of COVID than those who were being hospitalised back in January. Vaccination has worked. At the end of the day, the government has done an excellent job of procuring and rolling out the vaccine, and it is allowing the government to take a very cautious approach to lifting the lockdown compared to the situation we find our competitor economies in. And that continues. But I want to see the data. And I would again emphasise that there is a human cost, a societal cost, a mental health cost to continuing with lockdown measures. And we're going to be paying that price again for another 4 weeks.
Yes.
And that's going to be with us for a long time, Jo.
Margaret?
The vaccination is working. It's not that it has worked. We haven't got enough people with the second vaccine. And we know that when you get the second vaccine, Andrew, at that point, you are much better protected. It's an 80-something% protection as opposed to a 30-something protection. So we've got to go for that. And you don't know. I don't know. You're not going to know this afternoon, bluntly, Andrew, whether or not the data tells you anything. It's far too early. But we are beginning to see, from this new strain, we're beginning to see people who've had the double vaccine sadly losing their lives. Now, they may have other conditions, there may be all that in play, but I have to say the responsible thing to do, what we can't have is flip-flopping. We've had enough flip-flopping from this government. We can't have going back, coming forward, going back, and it's better to wait another month. Although I agree passionately with Martin about protecting people. I chair a theatre, Jo, in East London, and we've had a lot of people who have not been covered with financial support leaving the whole of the arts and the creative sector, which is a disaster, not just for our creativity, but for our economy. And the Chancellor has got to extend support both to businesses and individuals to cover that.
Right. Well, Anita, on that, I mean, business owners, hospitality venues, the travel industry will be particularly cross and disappointed by what some of them feel is a parliamentary or Westminster consensus on this issue. Andrew says he's not sure whether he'll vote for it. He'll wait to see the data. What do you say to those people?
I mean, I think they're frustrated at the reality that for a year and a half, they've been in a situation where they haven't been able to fully, run their business, live their lives and contribute to the economy, from the arts to hospitality to all the other sectors that have been profoundly and deeply affected by the past year and a half. So I think that the government was pretty clear in its roadmap when it said data, not date, and it said the earliest of the 21st of June. So it was allowing some businesses to plan, but also allowing for some flexibility. And I think that's what we're seeing play out right now.
Right. Well, Martin, you mentioned
agree that we should have closed the border.
Well, I think think the
earlier, that's the big mistake.
No, but the challenge around the border was simply that we didn't even identify the variant until after the borders had already been closed. Like, we weren't aware of the fact there was this strain. There was additional data coming from Pakistan and Bangladesh, but not the same in India. And I think the government actually did take quite a cautious approach. So it feels as though we're kind of retconning it and criticising the government after the fact.
No, I have to say to you, they waited 3 weeks too long. And if they'd closed the border earlier, we would be in the position where our European colleagues are. They've vaccinated fewer people, but they're opening their society more quickly. And that's a tragedy, for all the things that Andrew has said about, everything from people's mental well-being.
Australia shut their borders immediately within India, but they've still got the Delta variant from India. That's now they're now having to lock down again in Australia. They shut their borders immediately. It's very hard to keep these variants out, given the nature of their transmissibility around the world.
All right.
And I think what we're seeing from Labour, honestly, it feels like hindsight 2020, again, critiquing after the fact. The reality is the government has taken tough and very cautious decisions, and yet every moment, Labour says nothing at the time, but then 2 months later, they say, you should have done this months ago.
I have to say to you, the government has been flip-flopping. It's been flip-flopping constantly. And yet again, it's absolutely clear. I'm not comparing us with Australia, Andrew. I'm comparing us with our European colleagues. And in Europe, they're opening up more quickly because they closed their borders and therefore prevented the Delta virus.
Let me bring Martin in. You wanted to say something, Martin?
So I'm just listening about all this argument about with hindsight or without hindsight, and I'm not in the political sphere. I don't have the data that any of you do, but I do read the newspapers. And what I do know is we had headlines for weeks of enormous numbers of cases in India. Forget the variant. There were enormous numbers of cases in India. There were news reports every night of huge numbers of people dying in hospitals in India. And for me, whether it was a new variant or not, that would have seemed to indicate that we should have had careful border controls at that point. Okay. So the argument with hindsight, it actually turned out that the reason for all those huge number of cases was because there was a variant, seems to me somewhat irrelevant. We all know intuitively we should have closed the borders a few weeks earlier. We all know there's a nervousness to reverse the planning here. We all understand that there is imperfect decision-making. But the sort of political type of narrative here about, oh, you're trying to do this with hindsight, I wasn't involved in that, and I'm not a scientist, but I do watch the media and do watch the reports coming out of India, and we knew for weeks before the borders were closed there were high numbers of cases, and it seems that was a miss.
Andrew?
No, Australia did close their borders almost immediately, and they've still got the so-called Indian variant.
But trivial numbers of cases and less numbers than we have. That's the point. If we closed it earlier, we would have had less cases and should have been able to contain it more.
Australia compared to ours.
Well, yeah, about a half, but they've got a lot less than half the cases, isn't it?
I don't know the numbers precisely in Australia, but I do want to go back to your point, Martin, on furlough and look at the Daily Mail headline, which says furlough will not be extended. Rishi Sunak rejects pleas from businesses and says help scheme will begin to be phased out from July the 1st, even though Freedom Day is likely to be delayed. Martin.
Well, look, I mean, to an extent, furlough is not my biggest issue. My biggest issue is people who've been excluded from any form of support at all. And
yes.
Many people have sadly taken their own lives on the back of that. There are still huge swathes of limited companies and self-employees and freelance PAYE and those whose companies wouldn't furlough them and new starters and hosts of other people, millions of people who haven't had any support. And this is dire news for them. Within the furlough arena, I mean, furlough is carrying on. It's just employers will have to contribute more to it, which I'm sure they're not particularly happy about. On the other hand, that perhaps some of the logic behind that is we also have a desperate need for more employees within the hospitality area, and some companies aren't able to get hold of them. So I suspect the Chancellor thinks on the furlough basis that there's some market, sort of labour market mobility there, that people could move from one job to the other. I mean, I think for the sake of an extra 4 weeks, you may as well just delay everything and keep the furlough system as it is now, because that would stave it off, and the cost of that is relatively small. But again, I mean, the big thing on the back of this for me is those millions of people who were financially viable, supporting themselves, paying taxes, had businesses before this, and solely due to the pandemic, have had their businesses collapse, their income collapse, and had no help from the government, and who are frankly going to be, the welfare state is going to having to be helping out for years to come, which was a short-sighted decision on behalf of the government and the Chancellor. There were millions we could have helped, we haven't helped, and I'm afraid now we're going to have to help them for the long term, damaging their finances, the country's finances, and millions of people's well-being and mental health. And I still find that sticks in the craw somewhat on that.
Well, Anita, you made that very clear, Martin. Anita, you were nodding at the beginning of what Martin was saying about delaying everything, including possibly the furlough scheme.
Oh, no, I think I was agreeing with Martin that actually I think we're going to see some rebalancing in the economy. It seems as though there's quite optimistic figures coming out about our ability to bounce back. And in that scenario, I think you will see some labour movement that does allow a lot of the people that have suffered and not been able to find employment and keep employment through this period able to get back to some kind of job. So I'm pretty optimistic actually about the prospects for the UK economy, especially because it seems as though the Prime Minister is going to allow perhaps some flexibility around, allowing weddings to go ahead, those kinds of industries which are massive and really depend on that summer trade.
Right, and there may be an exemption. We'll find out, won't we, later on. Margaret?
Well, I'm glad there's an exemption for weddings.
Well, there might be. We don't know, but we'll find out.
But what I was going to say, the figures demonstrate that the economy may grow more quickly, but I think the point that Martin is making is so important. First of all, there's some businesses that have gone. For them, it's gone. And there are some that are going to go now. And anybody who listened to anything on the media yesterday, you'll have seen some people, particularly in the hospitality sector, saying they can't survive. And the second, it's this issue about freelancers and self-employed who simply weren't covered. And, yet again, we're putting further pressure on them. And I think the Chancellor, we've got to take the decision. It may be a unanimous decision, actually, if Andrew comes along with it. But we've got to take that decision. And the Chancellor ought to put that extra little money in to protect those who have suffered the most economically because of the...
Yes or no? Would you go along with that, Andrew, before we move on?
Well, it's not yes or no. I think anyone who's out of pocket because of the government's decision to delay reopening has got to be compensated. It seems ludicrous that we have supported businesses all the way through this pandemic and then dropped them at the end. And I would just add that I think the hospitality industry is going to suffer a recruitment problem because it's human nature that if you've felt that this is an at-risk business for the last 12 years, the restrictions government measures have placed upon it, that people may decide they want to work in a different sector to the hospitality sector, in which case wages will have to rise to attract them back.
All right, let's have a look at this headline in The Guardian newspaper. Boris Johnson closes G7 summit held with an amazing backdrop, of course, with the weather and the beaches in Cornwall, with vow to protect integrity of UK. PM is careful not to escalate row about reports that Macron suggested Northern Ireland was not part of the UK. This is following discussions around the Northern Ireland Protocol and the potential ban on chilled meats going from Great Britain to Northern Ireland in order for the EU to safeguard the single market. Now, in a reported conversation with the Prime Minister, it was said that Boris Johnson said, imagine sausages from Toulouse were blocked from being sent to Paris, to which the French president, you can see both gentlemen here in the pictures, replied it's different because Paris and Toulouse are part of the same country. Well, to that, the Prime Minister said Northern Ireland and Great Britain are also part of the same country. And there was something of a row about those reported remarks. The Foreign Secretary Dominic Raab, you heard in the headlines, said the remarks were offensive from Emmanuel Macron and that EU figures characterised Northern Ireland as somehow a separate country. Margaret, do you agree with Dominic Raab that those comments reported were offensive?
I just despair, Joe. Boris Johnson was, the driver of Brexit. He was the architect of the Irish protocol, the protocol for Ireland. He signed the withdrawal agreement. Get on with it now. And fighting these battles of the past, it's like a sort of broken record, really, rather than actually moving forward and negotiating within that is really, really important. I'll tell you what came out of me for the G7, and it's reflected in this, is it was, we talk about global Britain. We've had this slogan, and it was proved that it was a slogan. It wasn't reality, because what's broken down is trust in Boris Johnson. That's what's gone. And the trust has gone in part because of what he's done about overseas aid, in part how he's handled the law that was passed only in November, December here. It's broken down trust. So for God's sake, put those battles, Andrew, I include you in this, put those battles behind you. Get on now and sort it. And
well,
I don't
Andrew,
know whether this is about Toulouse sausages or English sausages, or are we going to end up having Australian sausages if we ever get an agreement signed with the Australians? But what we need, in the interests of Britain, British industry, British people, is for our politicians now, our government, to actually negotiate within the framework of the legislation they created.
Andrew?
Well, the reality is, Joe, that we're actually in a trade war with the EU, led by President Macron, who seems to see this political capital for him in his re-election next May in attacking the UK. To put it all in perspective, the trade between the UK and Northern Ireland, the rest of the UK and Northern Ireland, is 0.0008 of 1% of the GDP of the single market. Yet it's attracting 20% of all the checks on goods.
Yes.
That puts things clearly into perspective that, under the Northern Ireland Protocol, both sides are to promote trade between frictionless trade between the UK and Northern Ireland. Clearly, they're not doing that. The protocol's not working. It's being used as a stick to beat us, and I'm afraid it's going to get worse before it gets better. And I think we're going to have to threaten to suspend the protocol as we can under Article 16 due to disruption to trade within the United Kingdom.
Margaret?
But that, Andrew, is destructive ideological politics being put ahead of the interests of the British.
Margaret, by the EU.
No. It's like a group of squabbling children. It's not. It's both sides have got to actually just sit down and negotiate their way through that into the detail of the protocol. You signed it. You wanted that. You wanted that to happen. This is the reality of life. This is the reality of life after it. Pardon?
The protocol is there. It says that the Joint Committee is there to sort out problems and deal with them in a pragmatic way. 20% of the checks for 1/1200th of the trade is disproportionate. It's 3 times more checks than they carry out in Rotterdam to all the goods imported into the European Union, and twice the checks of importing goods into France. But this is being used as a stick to beat the UK.
Honestly, Andrew, you guys signed up
Those
to
are the
it.
facts.
You guys signed up to it. You've now got to live with it and negotiate with it within its parameters. And to abandon it does open a trade war which will benefit absolutely no British citizen, no British business, and certainly will not help establish Britain with any credibility anywhere in the world.
Right, I'm going to bring the others in. Anita, and we'll come back to this claim that has actually come from the Department of Agriculture in Northern Ireland. This is the fact that the EU seem to be doing 20% of their checks on the periphery of the EU in Northern Ireland. We have found it, as I say, in the Department of Agriculture. We haven't been able to actually find official figures from the EU. But you heard Andrew saying there, Anita, that perhaps we will have to unilaterally threaten to abandon the protocol again. Is that really going to help?
I think we can all take the heat out of this discussion. It's absolutely right that we continue to have a conversation with the EU about the practical implications of the protocol. It feels to me as though the EU has taken a vigorous and spirited approach to implementing the protocol. It feels to me as though Macron has been unhelpful and insensitive in his language, but I think that there is room for middle ground. We are not on the verge of all-out war. Neither should we throw our hands up and say, well, this is the inevitable consequences of the protocol. There is a way through. And remember that this is impacting the day-to-day lives of people in Northern Ireland, so we do need to find a solution.
Is there a way through, Martin? A middle ground?
Well, I don't propose to be an expert on the Northern Ireland Protocol in any way. What I do know is that we do have borders within countries right across the world, whether it's the federal system in the United States, whether it's our Foreign Office giving a different advisory right now or between travel and Spain and the Canary Islands. And it does seem to me that the UK government agreed with the EU to put a border in the Irish Sea. And if there's going to be a border in the Irish Sea, then we're going to have checks and balances that come into that. On the other hand, I think there is some truth in what Andrew says that Macron sees this as a good way to show he's tough when he's facing re-election next year. Though then again, we did help him promote it, but it was in a private conversation with the Prime Minister, I believe, with officials around, and then it came out to be in the public, which does sort of spark a bit of frisson. If you're going to have a war, then it seems to be a little bit of an incendiary way to act. We're going to have to find a way through this because there is no other option. But I think that, you know, the fact is we, or the government agreed as a nation that we would have a border effectively in the Irish Sea as one way to work through this. And that's what we agreed to do. And we might not like it now, but then we shouldn't have signed the document.
Right. Margaret, interestingly...
one of the biggest problems is that having spent most of my life in the food industry, I'm well aware, and so are UK consumers, that we have the highest food standards in the European Union. It's ludicrous and unnecessary.
Well, Margaret, you can pick up on that, but also Keir Starmer, the Labour leader, has said having checks between Great Britain and Northern Ireland, he's just said it, I think, in the last hour, is not the way forward. So in that sense, he agrees with the government. Having any checks between the Republic and Northern Ireland is absolutely not the way forward, so we're going to have to make progress. You agree with Keir Starmer on that?
Yeah, and if Andrew is right that we have higher food standards, you then begin to wonder what on earth this argument is all about. Because if that is really the case, why on earth can't they come to a compromise? Except it's driven by ideology. And I have to say one thing with Anita, I agree so much, we probably haven't talked about it enough. If we don't sort this out, we do endanger this very fragile peace that we've got through the peace process in Ireland, and we should always have that at the front of our minds in these negotiations. Completely agree with that.
There's no doubt, though, that the current interpretation of the Northern Ireland Protocol is in clear breach of the Good Friday Agreement. That is a huge problem, which is not being acknowledged by all politicians. And David Trimble, the only surviving author of that agreement, completely agrees with that. It's the EU's interpretation is in breach.
You're belligerent. I mean, it may have been that Macron said things that were insensitive. I think Dominic Raab probably did too. So both sides have acted in an insensitive, inflammatory way. And just to put all the blame on the Europeans is really fighting the old battles. For heaven's sake, just move on. And for everybody's sake, for the sake of Northern Ireland, for the sake of everybody here in the UK, settle down, sort it out. And if we really have got higher food standards, what is all the fuss about?
Well, and on that then, are you clear what Keir Starmer has in mind when it comes to being able to have a system where there are no checks? I mean, the EU say they have to protect the integrity of the single market. And Keir Starmer says, the Labour leader, that we shouldn't have any checks at all. So what is the way through?
Well, I'm not clear because I've only just seen heard those remarks from you, Joe. But I imagine what it is with us in the negotiation accepting the EU standards, food standards in that instance.
Right. Well, Andrew, well, if you accept those, it's all done.
Absolutely, under no circumstances. That's exactly what the European Union want, because it hamstrings us. We won't be able to do free trade agreements around the world, and that's bring us back under their orbit and neutralises all of Brexit. That's the plan. Margaret, you're falling into the trap immediately.
Andrew, you can't have it all ways. If you say that the British food standards are higher than the standards elsewhere, why not accept
these now and in the future?
Let Margaret finish her point, Andrew.
If you say that, if that is right, how on earth is accepting the European food standards going to impede any free trade agreement with any other country? It'll only impede a free trade agreement with another country if we're lowering our food standards. That's the only situation in which it'll impede it. Otherwise,
we don't know what legislation the European Union will pass in the future. We can't sign up to that. That's not the basis of being a sovereign, independent nation that the people voted for at the referendum, and we've delivered.
All right, we're going to hear from Arlene Foster because she is resigning today as First Minister in Northern Ireland. Let's have a listen.
I wish my successors as party leader and First Minister well, and I want to thank politicians from right across the political spectrum for their good wishes. I've been overwhelmed. Even some in the naughty corner found something good to say. If only we'd said all those nice things a few years ago, it would save us a lot of time. My time as Northern Ireland's First Minister may have come to a close abruptly, but I remain someone with a passion for service, for Northern Ireland, and for the Union.
Arlene Foster there. Let's return to the naughty corner here on Politics Live and talk about scams. This headline in The Times, it says, warning to consumers as reports of attempted scams surge. Now, an estimated 36 million adults have been targeted by scammers since January, according to Citizens Advice. Just to give you an idea of some of the things we're talking about, it's fake deliveries, government contacts and false investments. One area that's proved very fertile territory for scammers is that of cloned websites. Just showing our viewers here, this is where a website looks legitimate but actually is a way of stealing people's credit card details. TV licensing payment example here, and many of these are very convincing. We can also show you another one. This is a cloned website of thegovernment.uk of claiming your refund and asking for your profile and card details. Martin, you're only too aware of all the scams out there. Citizens Advice and the government are calling on people to report scam attempts to help protect themselves and others. Is that what you would advise too, money-saving expert?
If you ask me with my day job hat on, I would say anyone who thinks they're being scammed should, of course, report it to Action Fraud. If you ask me on a politics programme, I will say that the fact is Action Fraud is a flaccid organisation that does very, very little, is totally under-resourced. This is the biggest crime in the country, fraud, and it has virtually no resources for investigating, and if you report to Action Fraud, nothing will happen. We have an online safety bill due to go through Parliament. Ludicrously, outrageously, even though it's been going on for years, while the government has included user-generated content as scams in that online safety bill, it is not including paid advertisements. Now, as someone with the worst compliment in the country of having the most scammed face alongside Richard Branson, myself and him are used in more scam adverts than any others. I do wish Boris Johnson had the trust levels that we did so that he was being scammed too, because if he did, they would be putting online scam adverts in the bill. It is a disgrace. They don't understand the modern world. This isn't you pay for an advert in the newspaper and you've got editorial. What's the difference between a promoted post? If I pay for a post to be promoted, does it then become an advert? If I write my content with no checks and it goes onto Facebook or Google, it's an advert. What's the difference between that and user-generated? And when I have had, I sued Facebook and got a settlement for £3 million to set up Citizens Advice Scam Action and to have a scam ads reporting button in the UK. I've been doing this for 5 years, and when the government says to me the reason they're not including scam ads in the bill is they haven't done a consultation because it's new, I do feel like saying that is balderdash or baloney or name your other B words. It's completely nonsense. We have an agreement. No, not on air. I'll give you balderdash and baloney again, but give it with the invective that it deserves. It's the, we've had letters, the banks, the consumer organisations, the FCA supports putting scam adverts in the bill. It's absolutely ludicrous and short-sighted. And the idea that they'll be doing a consultation on this next year, how many millions of people's lives need to be ruined? And don't think that these scams are just about finances for vulnerable people. Yes, many vulnerable people are hurt. My Money and Mental Health Policy Institute shows that you're many times more likely to be a victim of scams if you've got mental health problems. But the problem is, when you're scammed, it destroys your well-being, it destroys your mental health. And Westminster, while it focuses on its own navel-gazing issue of fake news, which I agree is important, and that's in the bill, has failed the public on the more prosaic, but actually much more personal, relevant, and in many cases dangerous thing that needs to be regulated with is scam adverts, and I'm desperately hoping we can get them to change their minds as the bill goes through.
Should they, Andrew?
I can't disagree with much that Martin says. I think we all know that the police's appetite and ability to detect fraud is lamentable, and particularly online fraud, which we're seeing a huge growth, especially during lockdown. The government informed me that a large number, a proportion of the 20,000 new police officers they're recruiting are going to be with specific skills in online fraud, and that there will be a consultation early next year on cracking down on online advertising fraud. But I share many of Martin's frustrations. It's overdue. It's desperately needed.
Margaret?
Andrew and I can agree. Martin, I'd love to work with you on this. So here's an offer, but in two accounts, because this touches very much the work I do around financial crime. And as you say, fraud is now the biggest crime in our country. So I'd love to work. And I'm also on the online harms bill. There are a lot that, it's good that we've got the bill, but there are a lot of omissions. I'm fighting around anonymity, which is another evil that allows a lot of often legal but harmful content to appear online. And I'd love to work with you. So there is an offer for us to produce, if the government does it, an amendment which I hope tackles a thing that you have highlighted so effectively.
Right, well, you two should talk to each other about that after the programme. Anita, there are various services. We did hear, of course, the double answer there from Martin about what he would advise and what he would say on Politics Live. Is more legislation necessarily the answer, or is it the under-resourcing that we heard also from Martin for action fraud?
I think as a former government advisor, I've seen a lot of legislation go through the House with good intentions, but not necessarily address the core problems. So I have a great deal of sympathy with Martin's position. I completely agree that it must be incredibly painful to see your face used in order to target people, whether they're vulnerable or not, because as he says, it's incredibly soul destroying. I just think that the government's probably taking a more mature approach and kind of saying, yeah, this is a really important thing. We should probably get it right and go through the detail and figure out how exactly we're going to resource and tackle online fraud, rather than putting a few extra lines in a bill that doesn't necessarily have all the thinking that needs to happen in order to make the legislation really work. And I think Margaret has also said, that she has other issues like anonymity that she wants to tackle in this bill. It feels as though this is going to be a massive bill already. And I just wonder if it isn't better and actually isn't going to be quicker to have it looked at as a standalone issue.
Martin?
I'm afraid that's just nonsense. We have been talking about what we need to do on this for 5 years with many organisations who are very experienced at legislation, policy institutes like my own. We know what needs doing. To kick this into the long grass, we are in an epidemic of scams at the moment, exacerbated by the pandemic. And to make it another year or two, which is the truth of what will happen if we try and leave this type of legislation and ignore scam adverts in it, just means destroying possibly hundreds of thousands of people's lives on the back. And I'm not willing to countenance that. I have said to the government, I'll be honest, that I will publicly continue to say it needs to be in the bill, but I will, of course, if that doesn't happen, work with them on what goes on next. But when you've been shouting about it for years, when you've been trying to say to Westminster, please look at this other issue as well, of course, vulnerable children being abused online is horrendous, as is the challenge to our democracy of fake news. But the scam issue is real, prosaic and damaging to people's lives on a daily basis. And, it leaves so many people. Just remember the stat. There are 400,000 people in England alone in 1 year who contemplate taking their own lives due to finance, 100,000 who attempt it. That's how serious this issue is. And people who are scammed are bumped right up into that category. To say let's do a bit more thinking about it and delay it a long time isn't something I can morally agree to.
All right, we're going to leave that important issue there, and hopefully you two will talk afterwards, Martin and Margaret. I'm going to show everybody this headline in the Daily Mail. England fans obey Gareth Southgate, and the FA is pleased to respect players taking the knee with cheers drowning out the boos at Wembley ahead of opening Euro 2020 match against Croatia. We're going to show you pictures here of the England players taking the knee. The Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, was asked about this at the weekend. He said it was totally wrong to boo England players. He said that fans should be supporting them and not booing them. Andrew, because the Prime Minister has spoken on this issue in that way, does it settle it?
I think the Prime Minister's made his position clear. I think the FA have handled this tremendously badly by choosing a symbol which is synonymous with Black Lives Matter campaign and all it stands for: defunding the police, opening the prisons, opening our borders, smashing Western capitalism. I think they should have chosen a symbol that we could all unite around. Right. I totally agree with the Prime Minister. He said that he wasn't in favour of taking the knee and the symbolism of it, but he also said that we shouldn't boo our national football team. But I mean, this is, the same FA that in the 1930s thought it was quite acceptable for the England football team to give a Nazi salute, an appalling Nazi salute in Germany at that time.
But Andrew, you have highlighted.
I think we need to get politics out of sport.
Right.
I don't think they mix. I think people go to watch sport not to have politics. They want to relax. And it's our national game. We want to get behind the national team. It's tremendously good for our well-being if the team performs well. And we don't want to see booing.
Anita, can you take the politics out of sport?
I couldn't disagree any more strongly. I really think that it's absolutely right for players, if they want to show some solidarity and want to show that they support equality and they want to stand against racism, to do so. I really don't think that the majority of people in this country associate taking the knee with BLM, the political movement that supports things like defunding the police. I think most people see it as a broader gesture, regardless of the reality. Most people see it as a broader gesture of just general support for equality. Now, I would make this point. It's absolutely the case that players should show their an individual responsibility and support for ensuring that there's equality in the country. I think that the football associations could do more, much more, than just allowing people to kneel, to really promote inclusivity, allow for promotions of people, for instance, from all sorts of backgrounds into the higher echelons, for instance. And I think that politics and football do mix, in the sense that this is about how we make our society better. That's what politics is about. That's partly what football contributes. And I don't think that you can say the two things should be divorced from one another.
Andrew?
Well, I had a letter from the Director of Diversity at the FA last week, and she maintained that taking the knee was a tradition of 200 years. I don't agree with that. It is to choose that symbol, which is synonymous with Black Lives Matter. And it doesn't matter really whether the public think it is or not. No doubt Black Lives Matter will claim that it is overt support for their campaign, and they are basically an anarchist movement, and I can't support it. And I want to unite the country behind our national team, and I think the FA were tremendously ill-advised to use that symbol when why can't the players put their shoulders, their arms around each other's shoulders before the game and get into the huddle?
Let me ask the others, because we haven't got long.
Unity.
Margaret?
Well, honestly, Andrew, I think you've got to think your argument through. I mean, I've said today I'm going to be supporting the Prime Minister on his proposals for extending the COVID restrictions. That doesn't make me a Tory. I can support an issue without it actually meaning you support a movement. And the other thing, just thinking about these footballers, to think these footballers, multimillionaires, are all rabid Marxists is just for the birds. They're not motivated by that sort of politics. But footballers are fantastic role models. And there is a lot of racism in football, as there is in other parts of society, and using their position as role models and using actually these important football matches when millions of people are watching us and millions of people influence it, to make a remark about the sort of values we have as a society, the anti-racist values, is hugely important. Not enough. It's a start, but it's a very, very important symbol, and you should be getting behind the English team and willing them on.
How do you see it, Martin?
I think many people use the same symbol to mean different things. Andrew, I am slightly worried by your logic, because I'm afraid to tell you that there are members of the far right who use the English national flag as a symbol of far right support. But I'm sure you wouldn't agree that we should ban that from being waved at English football matches. And again, I think the players have stated, these players, many of whom have been victim to horrendous racism on social media, that they are taking a knee to support black players and an anti-racist action. And I could never say booing that. And just like Margaret nicked my point, but I'll let her. But these are multimillionaires who I don't think are trying to espouse some radical Marxist Black Lives Matters, where those two things, not that Black Lives Matter is, but that's what it's been accused by some of being a front for Marxism. I don't tend to believe that, and I certainly don't think that that's what those players think. So, symbols are used by many people. We need to listen to why they say they're taking the knee. knee, which is an anti-racist action that I think we can all support. And I accept that some people won't like it. And then I would suggest that if they're in the stands, they should stand there silently with their hands by their side. They don't need to clap. But booing something like this with our English national team at the moment is not a good symbol and not something that
Andrew, in the final seconds.
I agree that we shouldn't be booing our national team, but again, the blame for me lies with the symbolism and why did they choose that symbol? They know it is synonymous with Black Lives Matter.
So you're not converted by what you've heard, then?
I'm not converted, and ultimately, you're absolutely right. In a free society, which hopefully we might be in another 5 weeks to be able to get out of.
We're off. See you tomorrow.
Oh, it's got to do with Black Lives? No, told you yesterday was fucking hindsight. Catherine Ashley was never in Black Lives Matter, and we did that way before. You got kicked off the fucking NFL for it. You've got bad memories. Anyway, see you tomorrow. Look, somebody fucking watching, but this channel's completely dead.